For people of a certain age, Will O The Wisp refers to a TV cartoon character voiced by Kenneth Williams. Yet for everyone, the Will O The Wisp is a somewhat tricksy figure, an amorphous term from folklore all over the world. We're going to stick with Northern European folklore here, where one of the common points is the appearance of ghost lights seen over swamps and bogs. Stories generally explore how these lights lure travellers off the path. Sometimes the wisps are specific figures who lead the traveller astray. Here they take the traveller to some perilous spot and then blow out their light so the traveller is stuck. The light can be a form of punishment. Catherine Briggs noted that a man who had moved his neighbour's landmarks would be doomed to haunt the area with a flickering light. Yet more tales explore the idea that the wisps guard treasure. So as you can see, we do have a lot to dig into in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are moving on to our second spectral creature of this month's theme, but I just wanted to quickly, before we get started, give you an update because last week I mentioned that I was going to Edinburgh for the weekend and I did indeed go on a ghost walk. I did indeed go in the Southbridge Vaults and I did indeed go to Greyfriars Kirkyard again. And yes, we went into the Covenanters prison and yes, we all stood around the Mackenzie Mausoleum. And nothing happened. So unless anybody only discovered scratches or other marks when they got back to their lodgings, basically it was a bit of a quiet evening. It was fascinating as always. The City of the Dead tours always are. But yes, it was a little bit low on the thrillometer, shall we say, where the Mackenzie Poltergeist is concerned. So I just wanted to fill you in just in case anyone was wondering how that had gone. So this week, on the other hand, we are having a look at ghosts of a certain type, but they're a bit of a strange term because sometimes they can refer to fairies, ghosts and many other things besides, and that is the Will O The Wisp. And I am just going to jump right in because when I started doing this one, it basically turned into a bit of a monster. And as always, these episodes are just intended as an introduction to a topic. You can always go and find out more if anything catches your eye. And if you do want to have a look at the references, they are all listed on the blog post that is in the show notes below. We are going to start off by looking at the connection, if indeed there is one, between Jack o' the Lantern and Will O The Wisp, because some of the stories do seem to conflate the two. Now, I have covered the story of Jack o' the Lantern in our Pumpkins episode, but the short version is this. A man called Stingy Jack is somewhat mean and, by all accounts, rather unpleasant, and being so manages to ostracise all of his friends, and eventually he starts drinking with the devil, as you do. After tricking him into giving him a longer life, Jack finally dies, and heaven won't take him, and nor will hell, because obviously the devil's a little bit annoyed at the way that Jack has been going on. So he's left wandering the earth with only a lump of burning coal and a hollowed out turnip to light his way. And that is where some people think the stories of Will O The Wisp came from, with this light then bobbing around in marshes and boggy ground and so on. A similar legend from Shropshire turns Jack into a blacksmith named Will, and for whatever reason, St. Peter gave him the chance to live a second life. Rather than making the most of it, Will squandered it on such debauchery that both heaven and hell refused to take him. The devil's only kindness was to toss him a lump of coal from the burning pits in hell so he could warm himself, and now Will wanders among the bogs, luring travellers to their death with his light, hence Will O The Wisp. Now, in both of these tales, the bobbing light in the marshes is either Jack or Will, but either way they've been transformed into this Will O The Wisp character by their punishment. Now, the Will O The Wisp does also have a whole load of other names as well, and it's sometimes called Peg-a-Lantern in Lancashire, Jenny with the Lantern in North Yorkshire and Northumberland, Joan the Wad in Somerset and Cornwall, and Hobbity's Lantern in Gloucestershire. The Norfolk name is apparently Will O The Wikes, and obviously they are referred to as spunkies in parts of Scotland. But it doesn't end there, because Will O The Wisp is also known as fairy lights, corpse candles, foxfire and faux fillet, among other things. And other people do call them ignis fatuus or foolish fire. Now, the first recorded sighting of these lights dates to 1340, when the Will O The Wisp is referred to as Canwyll Corph, or literally corpse candle in Welsh. And meanwhile, the term Ignis fatuus was only coined in 16th century Germany to lend some scientific credibility to the Will O The Wisp, which is also known as Irrlicht or erring light in German. The phenomenon first appears in English in 1563 as foolish fire that hurteth not, as reported by William Fulke in the Book of Meteors, and Sir Isaac Newton even explored them from a scientific point of view in Optics, or a treatise of the reflections, refractions, inflections and colours of light in 1709. So that gives us an idea of the different names that we'll have to go looking for when we look for Will O The Wisp in folklore. And a lot of these names do give us an idea of what people may have thought they were actually caused by as well. And of course, we can also look to fiction and popular culture of the time as a way of looking at how people thought about the Will O The Wisp. So William Shakespeare, ever the contemporary writer, mentions ignis fatuus in Act 3 of Henry IV Part 1 from 1608. And indeed, if you've ever read Dracula, the blue flames that are spotted either side of the road to the castle and described in Jonathan Harker's journal appear to mark treasure. And again, that book does actually reference the folk belief that these flames hid buried treasure. Ignis fatuus even appears in Book 8 of John Milton's Paradise Lost, and I quote, "Hope elevates and joy brightens his crest, as when a wandering fire, compact of unctuous vapour, which the night condenses, and the cold environs round kindled through agitation to a flame, which oft, they say, some evil spirit attends, hovering and blazing with delusive light. Misleads the amazed night wanderer from his way, to bogs and mires, and oft through pond or pool, there swallowed up and lost from succour far." And here, what's really interesting about this bit from Milton is the fact that a lot of what he's talking about also brings into an idea of how these things were actually created in the first place, which we will come back to. And obviously, we do also see the wisps in the Dead Marches of Lord of the Rings, where Gollum advises Sam and Frodo not to follow any of the lights in the marshes, referencing the lore around the wisp. Obviously, it does appear in many other books as well, but they are some of the more notable ones. And obviously it is difficult to know how far you can actually tell how many people really believed in a piece of lore, but when it appears in popular culture, you can sort of say that it's obviously there because it's going to be recognised by a wide audience. Therefore, it can indicate to an extent how wide the belief may have been. Now, I wanted to have a look for some described sightings, and Folklore Journal was quite useful for this. So Leon A. Houseman noted in 1958 the belief that the lights are the dancing souls of little children, and presumably this belief came from the sighting of the flames in old graveyards, which some think does explain their alternative name of corpse candles. And Houseman even relates seeing the lights himself while walking at night with his wife. He described seeing 7 lights, and they were around the size of a golf ball, glowing with a colour that varied between greenish gold and pale bluish. Apparently the wind made them flicker and disperse, although he does admit that he never saw them again after that one encounter. Meanwhile, in 1938, Ethel H. Rudkin spoke to a woman named A.B. in Willerton, Lincolnshire. And A.B. saw the Jenny lantern between a crossroads and a gate leading to a manor house. And strangely, this light always appeared on the road, which is unusual because normally they're seen over swamps and bogs and so on. A.B. described it as looking like a bicycle lamp, having the same colour and being the same distance from the road as a lamp would be. Both her son and daughter often saw it between 8 and 10 p.m. Now, obviously, at this point, you probably are thinking, maybe it was a bicycle lamp then. But a policeman apparently happened to see it one night, and he thought it was a bicycle coming towards him. And he actually stood still to let the bicycle get level with him, only the light actually disappeared when it reached him and there was no bicycle. So who knows what was going on there. By comparison, A.B. also noted seeing the Will O The Wisps on the lowland, although these were closer to the ground and redder in colour, and these ones apparently danced, unlike the steady movement of the earlier light, and actually moved from one place to another. One wisp would seemingly chase people, moving faster as the frightened person ran faster, and a vicar actually saw that one as well, which I think Rudkin basically puts in to kind of legitimise some of the discussion. And finally, Rudkin also notes one appearance of the wisp at Cameringham was so frequent that it became known as the Cameringham Light, although it must have then disappeared from view because she wrote about it in her diary in 1931, explaining that it had been seen again for the first time in years. Now, she does also make a big point of noting that it appeared at the end of a wet summer, which did make me wonder if the atmospheric conditions somehow had an impact on the appearance of such a phenomena. Now, there is a slightly different explanation for the corpse candle or dead men's lights as they're also known, and these were believed to be lights that emerged from a sick bed and then passed along the route the funeral would take to the churchyard. They were considered a death omen, and it was dangerous to block the path of a corpse candle. There was even an additional belief that if you saw one go past, you might discern a dark shadow carrying a light between its forefingers, or indeed the likeness of a candle carried in a skull. Now, this idea also appears in reports from Thuringia in Germany, and here people travelling at night might see a disembodied hand carrying a lantern. It only disappeared when they reached a town gate. Now, in one piece of lore, an old man saw one late at night and called out a greeting, thinking it was a fellow traveller. When he realised that the hand didn't actually seem to belong to a body, he lashed out at the lantern with his stick. Upon doing so, he was apparently knocked to the ground and was so discombobulated that he struggled to find his way home when he regained his senses. Meanwhile, a belief in Brittany held that people saw flames on certain nights coming from the Karnak stones, and everyone avoided the stones on these nights because they felt that the ones that were marked with flames were actually marking burial sites. Corpse candles also appear in Kintyre and the Highlands, and while they're not actually called corpse candles in Sussex folklore, they do appear there, in the idea that if anyone saw a pale light move over a sickbed, flicker around the room, and then vanish out of the window, it was believed to be a warning. Likewise, if a circular light was seen without a fire or candle present along the English and Scottish border, it was considered a death omen. So ultimately, we do have to ask, what are they? And according to the Spooky Isles website, and indeed this is what most people go with, the flames are ultimately a natural phenomenon. As vegetation and other organic matter decay, they give off gases like phosphine and methane. These then combust, leading to the burning flames with no apparent cause. And interestingly, in 1889, T. O'Connor Sloan actually described an experiment in Scientific American designed to show how you could sort of create your own Will O The Wisp. And in one of these experiments, you could lower a lit candle into a glass tube held vertically, and you would then light the heat that was rising from the tube to create a second flame inches away from the first. And here you're essentially lighting the vapour coming off the candle. Alternatively, you could light a candle, let it burn for a few moments and heat up the wick and then blow it out. But then if you lit the vapour coming off the wick, this would then create another flame. Now, as fascinating as the article is, it also doesn't explain how these phenomena could happen spontaneously in nature. And indeed, Howell G.M. Edwards pointed out in 2014 that no modern experimental analysis has been carried out on this phenomenon, and instead distilling the accounts from both eyewitnesses and scientists over 3 centuries reveals a range of observations about them. 1, they're often seen in marshes. 2, while they glow blue, they have a yellow centre, but it's not strong enough to light the ground below. And 3, the flames can be 2 metres above the ground, they're cool to the touch and last for around 15 minutes in one place. Now, I must point out as well that none of these commonalities from eyewitness accounts actually match the theories of marsh gas or bioluminescence. And because of the fact that, again, there's no way of explaining where the combustion actually comes from and why they would spontaneously combust in sort of quite wet or damp conditions. And the other problem that Edward notes is the lack of modern sightings, which Edwards does note is strange considering how easier it is to reach otherwise inaccessible places now. So basically, without flames to actually test, modern science is really at a bit of a loss to explore them more fully. So when people say, oh, they're just marsh gas or they're just bioluminescence, that's the theory that's being put forward, but Edwards would say that that hasn't actually been tested fully. Now, what do we make of the Will O The Wisp? And this is an absolutely massive topic, and there's so much that you could say about it, but obviously a lot of it lies beyond the length of the scope of one of these episodes. Now, one of the most fascinating things about the Wisp, and this is something that we didn't have space to get into, is its appearance all over the world, and tales involving the lights appear on every continent except Antarctica. And while the stories do vary across their explanations, the explanations are also similar across the world. So treasure, unbaptized souls, fairies and the dead appear again and again to explain what the lights are and what they're for. And true, some of the theories don't entirely fit the stories, because spontaneous combustion of marsh gas is fine, but how do you then explain its movement and lack of warmth? That said, its appearance in boggy or swampy ground would make sense from a scientific point of view, which would explain why you find them in cemeteries or neglected graveyards. Now, the fact that we don't see them now could be due to several changes. It could be due to a change in climate or even building patterns, because if you've got fewer bogs and marshes are being drained to provide land for building or agriculture, you're then losing the conditions that you need in order to make these lights appear in the first place. So with fewer places where they normally appear, where exactly would you encounter them? whether they actually are the souls of unbaptized babies, or whether they actually are Stingy Jack or Will the Smith trying to light their way for eternity, or whether they are indeed pixies trying to lure travellers off the road and into some kind of horrific environment, obviously remains to be seen. My natural inclination is obviously to tend towards the idea of them being related to the dead, but obviously that's because that's where my own personal research interests lie. So what I would love to know is, what do you think the Will O The Wisp actually is? Do you remember the cartoon from the 1980s? Do you think that they're trying to lure people into marshes, or do you indeed think it is just a normal natural phenomena that we've sadly lost sight of for various reasons? Please do feel free to let me know. As always, you can leave comments on the blog post that this episode belongs to, and the link to that is below. And it would be fascinating to see if anybody has actually seen a Will O The Wisp. Just because Edwards couldn't find any mention of them doesn't mean that there haven't been any. So bear that in mind. So it would be lovely to hear from you. Next week, we are going to have a look at The Grey Man of Ben Macdui, which was a request. So I hope that whoever requested that is listening. We are obviously not having a regular episode on the Saturday after that because it is Christmas Day. So I thought that we might actually take a bit of a break. I will be back in January with some of the folklore around Boudica, which again was another request. So that should be really interesting to start the new year off with such a fascinating figure. I just wanted to do one last shout out as well, that I am doing my talk about where Christmas festive decorations and things come from with Cresswell Crags, and that's on Monday the 20th of December, and the link to find out more about that is below as well. So it will be lovely to see some familiar faces at that one. But without any further ado, I will let you get on with whatever it was that you would normally be doing today, and I'll see you next week for our last sort of proper episode of 2021. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.